That's it.
Cad Bane, I've always seen him as a character. He's kind of like the Batman of the Star Wars universe. Batman has no superpowers, but he has these cool gadgets and he's really smart and he can take on characters like Superman and the Flash and Green Lantern. Cad Bane is very similar in that way in that he can take on Anakin, who becomes Darth Vader. He can take on Anakin and Ahsoka at the same time. He can take on Obi-Wan Kenobi and Quinlan Vos at the same time, 2-on-1. I wanted to take this character in live action, and as soon as you looked at him, not only did he look cool, but I wanted him to feel very capable. That this is a character that you don't know what he's gonna do, but he could take on anybody. One of the main appeals to me in doing this project was that Cad Bane had never been done in live action. This was about a year before the book of Boba Fett. We were coming up with our own designs. We were figuring out how could this character look and sound. It was a chance to do something that had not been done. So the first question was, is this even possible? Can you physically create a version of Cad Bane that functions in real life, that will allow a performance? Before I decided if we were going to do this project, before we wrote a single thing for a script, I quickly threw together a design. If we design along the face, then the nose is going to stick out. So I had this idea that instead to build the face away, and the eyes, instead of being where my eyes are, they're out here. The design wasn't where we wanted it. It didn't look enough like Cad Bane, but it was a proof of concept that said we could build this.
We've never done full prosthetics before. I've worked with them a little bit in the past, but this was totally new, and there is a lot more to it than I had ever thought. You have to have a life cast of your actor, and that is pouring a whole bunch of silicone over them and then making a hard case, pulling it off, pour stone into your mold, pull that off, and you have a statue.
And took clay and kind of, stuck it on there clumsily and made something really ugly, but it functionally was what I needed it to do. Our daughter Alexandria on this project, she's a brilliant artist, and she is a caricature artist as well. And so she can take people's features and then turn them into cartoony features. Well, she used those skills on this in reverse into something that looked realistic. And she just did wonders on this clay. It was just amazing. It was like, wow. She meticulously matched all the scars to exactly how his scars were in the show. The original inspiration for Cad Bane was Angel Eyes from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And one of the other things that I believe they took inspiration from in Good, the Bad, and the Ugly are these scenes of Tuco and Blondie. They both wander through the desert in different scenes and just get super dried out and crusted and just chapped. And I wanted that kind of a feel to Cad Bane's face because he feels like that in the show. We needed to design Cad Bane's hat, but it had to fit the clay head that we'd made. And so now we had this problem of what do we do?
I actually had to make a special mold just for fitting the hat.
Laura figured out how they had done the body models on the original Marvel movies with Captain America and Thor. They could build the costumes on those Marvel films.
I actually covered the entire head in this old school way with like masking tape and cellophane. Really, really tight, so it made the shape. I took extra special care not to damage the sculpture and then cut it off, filled it with expanding foam. This hat is really big. Really, really big. I was scared it was gonna be too big. But Kip was insistent, like, no, just keep making it big. Make it bigger, make it bigger. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this hat is enormous.
There's no real life examples to use. It's short in the front, it's long in the back, it's super wide.
Went through probably 4 or 5 different versions of building out this hat before I settled where we were. And then I went and started making it out of actual leather. Well, leather does not actually make the shapes of Cad Bane's hat. So we had this other challenge where we're like, we can't make this cowboy / rice hat looking thing with leather because it's not bendable, it's not moldable in that way. So we had to figure out where to cut everything precisely and how to stitch it back up into a shape that looked like the silhouette of Cad Bane.
After you've made this head, you have to carve it into little pieces, and then each of those pieces become your molds that you then make into the makeup and then stick it back on your actor. And at this point, Cad Bane did not have a plate on his head. And we had never seen Cad Bane with a plate on his head. No one had. As far as anyone knew, the last thing that ever happened to Cad Bane was he had a shootout with a young Boba Fett. Cad Bane was hit in the head and he was never seen again. Day came and I've got out my carving tools and I'm like, I'm gonna carve up this head. We gotta get this moving. And that's the day the episode came out for the Bad Batch with Cad Bane on it for his debut return. And you didn't see him with his hat off, but Lucasfilm released a piece of concept art on their site that just down in the corner, it had this little shot of Cad Bane with a metal plate on his head. I saw that and I was like, oh, that's how you answer that question of how he got shot in the head. It's brilliant. And so I was glad I got delayed cutting up our carving, because once you've cut it up, you've cut it up. There's no redoing it. Went back and immediately I carved this metal plate into his head onto our sculpture right before, and then right after that, cut the whole thing into pieces so that we could make our molds.
The first time we tried to cook Bane's head, there was some failure involved. Foam latex is kind of tricky. It's a science experiment. There's some chemistry involved. It's like baking, but smelly. And if you don't get it just right, you don't pull it out at the right time, it just completely collapses into this goo. So those heads failed, but we were using the Stan Winston school and we were eventually able to figure it out. We used them for lighting tests and coxswain tests, make sure that our colors were working. It turned out to be a good blessing in disguise.
Alexandria did such an amazing job painting this face. She would look at things like zones on the face. On a typical human face, where does it have more yellows? Where does it have more reds? Where does the blood flow the most under the skin? And even though Cad Bane's blue and green and purple, she was able to add enough of that, it still felt like something that was alive. To the point that a lot of people thought that Cad Bane's face was computer-generated imagery. They didn't think it was a real object because they just figured it couldn't be. Gotcha.
Just like when you're doing a character design, a silhouette is what's most important to a really good character in their costume. Some of the early design challenges with our costume was that Cad Bane is a cartoon character and no human is really that shape in real life.
How do we balance the silhouette of the character? One of the major ways we did that was with the feet. Laura designed these awesome spats that go over the boots and help shape the legs and the feet. And it balanced out those long fingers and a long head, such that when you look at it, it almost looks like his fingers are just normal length fingers. And his head just looks right.
With the fingers, first we started with a really hard substrate. They were unbendable and it wasn't working. We couldn't keep them on. There was no way to make this really practical because he had to be able to articulate his fingers. Like spinning those guns was not going to happen with hard fingertips. The silicone was so much better because it was flexible and I was able to find a mix that I liked that was stiff, like real flesh.
We had to make them so slender, in fact, that the fingers were ripping every day. Anytime I'm twirling the guns or doing that, the silicone was ripping apart. When I would grab the toothpick, I couldn't feel it. So I just had to grab it blind. I made kind of everything on the guns bigger to accommodate the length of his fingers so that the fingers could go in and out and maneuver with those blasters in the way that they should. Laura did all these amazing modifications to this great coat that she found. We wanted to do more than just make it feel like Cad Bane's coat, though. I wanted to take it to another level and add those extra layers of texturing that you expect from a film.
Texture really, really matters because as soon as you put a camera on it, you start losing everything.
I went in Photoshop and just put all these extra layers on, and then it was too much. And Laura, she figured out, okay, what's the right amount? And she went and stripped most of that out and then said, these are the right pieces, these are the right places, and then we put them together and it really worked.
He has this interesting breathing apparatus. We had to figure out how to get this thing to be on the back of the coat without yanking the coat back constantly or falling off. It went from, we have a harness underneath, we use rare earth magnets at one point, and finally, we're just gonna clip it on with a little bitty leather band and some Velcro. I cut the sleeves and made like these new little gloves that pulled the coat tight on the arms so we could get the bracers over the coat.
It would have been extremely easy for his gauntlets to get really bulky really fast. So we had to build them a couple of different times before we really got them right. A lot of the ideas, a lot of the thoughts we had, it was just too bulky. Cad Bane is the type of character that can jump and roll, and he can maneuver his blaster pistols and do all these things that you can't do if you have big clunky hands, if you have big clunky gauntlets.
Bane has iconic rings at the end of his gauntlets, and with our tight design, they would keep the hands from moving. The solution was to make the rings mobile, but still look like metal. So we took leather and PVC pipe, cut them down the middle, and laced them up like shoes, and then kept it this really nice job of painting it to look just like the gauntlets, nice and silver.
I really pushed Laura when she was doing the design for this. How do we keep this shape, but make them sleek? She eventually settled on this idea of we made them out of PVC pipes. We ripped the buttons off of an old blender. Other buttons were buttons off of power strips. Just like with all the props, we just slather them in Bondo so they would just look as grimy as I could get it.
Compared to Bane, Qualtech was so much simpler. Our biggest hurdle with Qualtech is that all Jawas are kind of the same. So how do we make ours unique and alive and knowable? That was really, really tricky.
Our Jawa Qualtech was very important to this piece. It wouldn't work without the Jawa because Cad Bane is just unequivocally, he's a villain. He's a very mean character, always killing people, he kidnaps children. He just does all kinds of just dastardly things. I mean, he's called Cad Bane for a reason. While we love the character, we've got to have, as an audience, a character that we can root for, a character that's a little more endearing, a character that's less villainous. Cad Bane has such a larger-than-life personality. He's not just cool, he's got all this swagger, he talks in a unique way, he goes around with his toothpick. How do we have a character that can hold their own with Cad Bane on screen and not just get completely swallowed up and disappear? Part of the dynamic you want with characters is contrast. And because Cad Bane is so serious, having a character that was so silly, it really showed you how serious, how grim Cad Bane is. We also got to see how skilled he is. Our Jawa, is shooting things crazy in the air, whereas Cad Bane's going around picking off dozens of stormtroopers. Because Cad Bane's so villainous, it would be easy for him in a film like this to just feel like a cold-blooded sociopathic killer. And so having our Jawa that he could play off against, where we could see him do things like be willing to work with the Jawa and give her her gun back, not killing her when she electrocuted him. Things like this give us just enough of these enduring qualities where we see these glimmers of humanity. Maybe he's not quite as bad as we know he is. I mean, he is not a good guy at all. But we give you just enough of something to hold on to that you feel like, I can watch this even though it's starring Cad Bane.
What you may not realize by watching our film is we actually had two Jawas. The larger one is 1/3 exactly bigger than the smaller one, because there were some things in the beginning that we weren't sure that the 8-year-old could do because they were complicated. If you watch our film, you see she did a lot of body acting that's very complex. It flows really well, so maybe not notice, but she had to be able to take really complex instructions.
I went and storyboarded them all originally with 2 different versions so that those shots could be switched out and shot with a scale double and it would still work. Fortunately, on the performance end, we didn't end up needing to use any of them. Qualtech worked with Annalise's performance in every scene and it was just amazing. We still had a couple of shots that we couldn't get on a technical side without a scale double. The shot of Qualtech powering up her blaster from inside of it. To get that shot the way we wanted to, we just needed the far bigger blaster so that we could really get in there and show it. And it looked great. I was real pleased with the scale double work, even though we didn't need to use it very much.
Well, how do we make our Jawa distinctive and individual? And at first we had this idea that we would give her a little techie little necklace, but in the end, Kip had this brilliant idea of why don't we give her a scarf? The little bags that she's wearing on her bandolier, those are hand-stitched. We didn't have a 3D printer of the scale required to manufacture these blasters. We manufactured these things in our shop in our garage. I went and searched for parts everywhere I could look that matched exactly, size for size, and in the end I think we had a really beautiful product. I always imagined Jawas being really kind of gross, so we really wanted to distress the Jawa costume a lot. It's actually acrylic paint to make it look like she's just been in the muck everywhere she goes.
Annalise and Alexandria, who played the Jawas, they actually went through and put the grunge on the 2 costumes and matched them each to each other so it was the same colors and the same patterns on the same places so that we could get it as close as possible. It didn't have to be perfect, but you do want it close enough that people aren't obviously noticing a difference.
If you do not distress your costumes in an extreme way, you lose texture, the camera will not see it. I use a fabric that's kind of a tweed that's got a whole lot of texture in it.
And Jessica Luttrell sewed these beautiful costumes.
Ooh, people? If you accidentally shoot me with that, I will bring you in.
So with the character of Bane himself, I'm not an impressionist, I don't do impersonations, and my voice obviously doesn't sound anything like Corey Burton that did the voice acting for Cad Bane in the cartoon.
I just wanted to get a feel for you boys. You fellas might want to step aside.
I took an approach that was more like what Rosario Dawson did when she was playing Ahsoka. While Rosario put a lot of work into making it feel like Ahsoka, she was never trying to fool you into thinking that it was Ashley Eckstein who voiced Ahsoka. It was distinctly Rosario's voice talking. I took a similar approach to Cad Bane. I put in a lot of work into making sure it felt like Cad Bane was talking so that we felt that it was that character, but I was never trying to fool anyone into thinking that I was the amazing Corey Burton doing his voice work.
Ain't you smart? The kid's got it all figured out. Now hand her over.
I'm a symbol too. Oh, fear, give me the tracker.
A film with no faces. So we knew because of quarantines and lockdowns that we weren't going to be able to get actors, we weren't going to have a crew. I had to think outside the box and how can we make a short film when I don't have anyone available to play in that film? And so came up with this idea that no one in the film has a face, which is an extreme challenge for a filmmaker. How do you connect with an audience when you're not seeing human eyes, you're not seeing facial expressions? And we knew that Bane was going to be our only face, and Bane was going to be foam latex prosthetics. So that was a big risk. And we went ahead and took it because I felt like we could pull it off. Our Jawa has no face, which would allow me to, if we had concerns with that performance because she's 8 years old, it would allow us to be able to move the voice to wherever, pick whichever part of her performance worked best. It gave us a lot of flexibility. Now, with the stormtroopers, because they had no face, not only could we duplicate them, but I could put whatever voices I wanted in afterwards and not have to worry about what we captured on the day. It's just part of the problem solving of making a film with no budget, with no crew, with no actors, just using what we had. I'll draw the Jawa with a smile on her face or, looking scared, and you wonder how much of this is gonna really come through in the camera. That was one of those things that I just had to move forward and say, okay, we're just gonna have to do the best we can and figure out how do we get all that emotion. But Annalise gave such an amazing performance, so expressive, there was never any question what Qualtech was feeling. If you look at the show like The Mandalorian, that character conveys a lot of emotion just through a helmet. It's just how he moves his head. When does he decide to look? One of the gallery episodes for Mandalorian, Deborah Chow was talking about how a lot of the emotion for The Mandalorian was conveyed through stillness. So we carried that philosophy through into our Cad Bane film because a lot of times the hat is covering his eyes. How does he move the head a little bit? How do those looks create that emotion when we have a face that can only articulate so much? We have eyes that for the most part don't articulate at all. I could do some subtle movements of the eyes with my cheeks. By scrunching the face, I could get the eyes to squint and do some things, but not a lot. It was only what the foam latex could do naturally. We didn't have any kind of apparatus in there to move the face. There's no animatronics. There's no CGI moving the face. And so the philosophy behind Bane's movement, behind his emotion, was almost like how do you do it with Din Djarin, or how does C-3PO convey emotion? And it's through that body language, and it's through choosing when to move and how do you film it. Between Alexandria doing such a good job of making this dynamic carving that you could look at from different angles and it felt different ways, and then Laura filming it from just the right angle with just the right lighting, you could really feel, is Bane annoyed? Is Bane angry? Is Bane surprised? All of that came through, and we were just so thrilled that when you've got a face that barely moves, that you could feel so much emotion from it.
Long live the Empire.
We have this beautiful, grand location, but there's a hike. Right when we want to go film, construction happens and the path is destroyed. We could not park near the location. It was like a mile hike to where we base camp. So we have to really pare down everything we decide to take down there because there's just the 6 of us. Depending on whether it has rained, the path changes. So there's little cliffs that you have to kind of walk over and shimmy down with equipment. It was quite a journey. Once we got to base camp every morning, we'd immediately break out the makeup and get Bane's makeup, his face and his fingers on as fast as we possibly could. Alexandria was the one who did all of the painting on our prosthetics. So when we get out on location, she would help me apply makeup. So she'd apply all the fingers, but she would also do the final finishing touches on how all of the prosthetics actually attached to each other and blended them right there on set. Prosthetic makeup takes a long time to apply. A big job that typically takes hours. We worked really hard during the design process to make sure that we could apply quickly and move on. We found a method that took about 45 minutes for makeup and another half hour for costume. That is lightning fast. As soon as that sun's up, we're gonna start burning daylight. While the girls finish this costume, I'm running around the location making sure that we choose the right spots to get started.
It was an interesting challenge to direct from inside makeup of this type. I can't see anyone standing directly in front of me. I can only see things in front of me overhead, but the hat's blocking. So I had this little narrow strip. A lot of times my son, whenever he wasn't in a stormtrooper outfit, he was having to hold this VTR monitor up above his head at weird angles so that I could see how I looked in the frame and I could direct things that were happening. Can't hear too well, can't smell anything. You can't feel anything because your whole body is completely covered up.
Now stagger back. Cut. All right, that last part I like.
As much as possible, we schedule days in partial costume or no costume.
You back up and
We did that so that I could focus on directing. But this is a piece about Cad Bane, so that was the rare exception. He's in the majority of the shots of the film.
But it was much different to direct something from encased in this outfit, and you can't take it off. Once we put it on, it's on for the day. So you got it on for the full day until sunset.
Good. All right, now go back to your mark. And I want you to go softly. Fire, move.
One of the interesting challenges with prosthetic costumes is the heat. It's always a challenge, but then in the Texas heat, it becomes an even greater challenge.
Our location is the San Gabriel River, and it's a bowl of rock. Traps in all the heat or all the cold. When we got to our location in the morning, it was typically around freezing. And then when the sun comes out, it's just, there is no shade anywhere and it's instantly hot. All the rocks are reflecting that light back at you.
And I wasn't able to last more than 10 minutes without an umbrella over me, or I probably would have just passed out.
Putting on makeup on Kip, he'd have to have his hands out, and his hands and his feet would go numb from how cold it was. And throughout the day, even though it started to get, 85, 90 degrees in there, his feet would still be numb from that morning. Kip was really, really big on making sure our family remembered that what we were doing was fun. And remind us, tell us jokes, do a little dance.
Somebody waits for you. For me.
We knew that to get through, it had to be fun. To want to continue, it had to be fun. There was a lot of days with our family, and it could be remembered as not fun or fun. And Star Wars is fun, and so our memory needed to be that too.
It seemed real early on like the way to go was to look at a lot of what was done in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and the Coen Brothers True Grit film, and just look at their cinematography, the shots. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly had all of these massive close-ups, which was a huge risk for us. But typically you would never do this because it's really hard for the makeup to hold up under that level of scrutiny. We wanted a lot of kind of extreme angles. I really like shots that are stacked up in interesting ways, where characters frame other characters in interesting ways, such as our shot across Cad Bane's gauntlet and his head leaning over when he's on the ground, and then in that little space in between, you're seeing the Jawa walk up.
We're shooting this gritty, ugly blue guy and this little girl with no face. How do I make this beautiful? So I tried to focus a lot on where is the light. It really helps to pull out the beauty of what you're doing. So when it came to light on our location, we had to really plan ahead about where the sun would be, because since we didn't have a crew, there's a lot of things that you would normally do to control light that we just couldn't bring down there. used the rocks as reflectors, which I did quite a bit. We filmed our pickup shots an hour away from our primary location, but I bet you can't tell.
We also looked at Kurosawa's Seven Samurai and how he would incorporate a repeated gesture into a character, which inherently helps the audience to feel like they understand who that character is, which was important for him because he had a big cast. In our case, it was important for a character like Bane, where we need to create an audience connection because he's a villain.
We had action scenes, stunts, but I was the only one on the set that has any stunt training. And so my kids are in the Stormtrooper outfit, and not only do they have no stunt training, but we don't have stunt versions of the Stormtrooper suits. So they can't bend over, they can't fall, they can't really do any stunts. We did do a couple of fun gags, like when Cad Bane grabs the Stormtrooper and electrocutes him by his face. We had a pad taped to the back of the Stormtrooper's head that we then removed in post.
When Bane shoots the trooper's foot and makes him fall over, we actually had two troopers there. Keith is already on the ground, on his knees. So when he shoots, they do a little switcheroo. When our commander is killed, we had to remove his leg armor so that he could fall onto his knees on a pad. And then in post, we put that armor back on him. Because of supply chain, our trooper blasters didn't come in. We had to get some Nerf-style guns from the store, took a hacksaw to them, modified them, spray painted them black. These are our background blasters in any of the shots that required more than one. For the shot with the fallen troopers, it was originally going to be a very complex shot with duplication. But Laura said, I want to try and shoot this practically. But we wanted several troopers in the shot, and we only had 2 suits of armor and we had 1 extra helmet. So Laura divvied up the armor between 3 people and arranged everything just perfectly so that it's all obscured by the way the camera's stacked up. And the shot actually looks really ridiculous when you're not behind the camera. Even walking was really tricky to do in this armor. The ground is extremely uneven there. Even the ground that looks like it's even is actually not at all. Our troopers were always walking through mud, over slick rocks. And of course, if your feet are soaked, they become freezing, and then that just lingers throughout the day. There was a lot of tripping and stumbling and awkward walking that it took a couple of days to really smooth that out, to get to where at the end we could do this nice, smooth minute-and-a-half walk that looked relaxed and casual. And then eventually it had to graduate up to running.
Rolling.
But when you can't see, you just have to memorize the terrain in between takes. And then you're doing the run blind, you're doing the jumping blind. And that's in like a 40-45 pound costume with steel-toed boots and weighted boosters on your feet.
In a costume like that, you can actually barely move. You can barely move your arms, you can barely walk around, you can't see what you're doing, and you can't feel anything. We only had the resources to make a single hero version of the Cad Bane costume and makeup. So there's no stunt version. So any stunts that I had to do fall into a bed of rocks. Crawling, fighting, jumping off the cliff. All of that is done with our hero version of the costume, so it had to be able to hold up.
Yay!
The shot of Cad Bane landing, I just jump in place. I'm climbing up on that rock, I just jump up, land, and then we cut out that part where I'm jumping up and make that Cad Bane coming down, and then he lands.
Acting is a funny thing. There were certain tasks that I was not physically capable of doing with those fingers on, like twirling the guns and holstering them with the fingers, or picking up the hat off the ground. But when I was in character and the camera was rolling, I could twirl and holster, could pick up the hat every time. It's just a funny thing.
Alexandria, when we were on set, she played the Shadow Trooper. She's also really, really strong. She hauled more equipment than anyone else.
The reason I used the Shadow Trooper is I knew I wasn't going to have anyone trained in stage combat besides myself, and I wasn't going to have anyone to do stunts. So I needed to do a way that I could have a fight with Cad Bane with just me on screen and nobody else. If the other character's invisible, then we can actually have a fight. And that's what we did. Fighting myself, getting punched, falling over, spraying gas, getting hit. And it was a fun thing.
When the Shadow Trooper shoots the blaster out of Bane's hand, we just attached a fishing line so we could yank it off screen. When our shadow trooper kneels to cloak, we had to remove the armor off of her thighs, and then we restored it in post.
Help her up.
But even then, it was painful and she couldn't get up on her own.
So I designed all the sequences early on so that the fights could hopefully be exciting, but simple based on what we had available. We had to think through every problem like that. What's a simple answer? What's a quick answer? What's a way to do this that will be effective, but that is not going to be crazy to pull off?
So the shootout is very interesting. There's a lot of rocks out in the riverbed where we shot.
But the primary location to do that, there's only about 6 rocks, and they're all clumped together. And if you look in either direction around them, it's just completely open for hundreds of yards. And so Laura got really creative with it. I imagine these old school television shows, you know, like an old episode of Star Trek where they've got 5 foam rocks and they just keep rotating them on wheels and push them around to get different sets. Well, we took that same line of thinking and we filmed these same 6 rocks from every conceivable angle. The stormtroopers and Cad Bane and the Jawa are all standing in the same places during that shootout. Because the riverbed flooded one day, we ended up climbing up into these more obscure rocks and we got extra shots in rocks that were much farther away that we never would have filmed otherwise. Originally, the commander, he was going to hide behind the rock and then get picked off. Emmy Farah, she was our art director, said, that's not enough. This character needs to be cooler than that. And then Keith had this idea where he was just improvising, just did this blocking motion. And that's where we had the notion of, okay, what if we give this guy a shield? And then we upped it. What if we gave him a bigger shield? And so we worked these things into the story. It's not just a bunch of troopers to shoot. There's also this one who's got an agenda and he's got these shields, and it really made that scene work a lot better. We had already filmed all of Bane's end of the shootout before we decided to change the commander and give him these shields and make it different. And so we didn't have that struggle originally in the edit. Bane just kind of came out and just started shooting everybody and tore them apart, and then that was that. And so now I had this challenge of, in the edit, in post, how do we take what we did have of Bane's end of that fight and create a conflict, create the conversation that the commander's having with him? Like, how do we work all that in? And so that was something that we kind of massaged all that in post and kind of found it. So as we were making this piece, Cad Bane was killing all these stormtroopers. Everyone started actually feeling sorry for the stormtroopers. These people are just doing their job and he's killing all of them. And so we had to rework some of that dialogue and make sure you knew that these stormtroopers weren't good guys, that you weren't feeling bad.
Keith played all of the stormtroopers. He played the commander.
Alexandria also played a few of the stormtroopers. They had a friend, Alana, that came out because we only had her for like an hour. And I think I ended up getting 2 shots out of her that I broke into 3. But other than that, almost all those shots were all him playing every stormtrooper. So we were duplicating him in the frame, figuring out camera tricks. It's the same person just moving around.
He was as close to an AC as I had. So if something did have to be moved and I just did not have the hands to do it, I would have Keith step in.
One of the scenes that I thought was very important was the end of the film where Cad Bane walks up on our dying shadow trooper. This would be a very powerful scene. It would capture Cad Bane's personality perfectly. Part of what makes it work was the amazing performance that Brandon Seidel gave when he's dying there. He's the dedicated member of the Empire that he is. The Empire was right, and now you have no chance, buddy. That gives us just enough where we feel like it's okay for Cad Bane to finish him off. It feels satisfying. And also, we just have that slight look where before he does it, Cad Bane looks over and makes sure the Jawa's not there to watch. And then he finishes him off. And he's doing this horrible thing because he gives that little look and checks first to make sure the Jawa's not there. It's just enough that we're like, okay, he has some little glimpse of something. There's some humanity there. There's some redeeming quality, however small it may be, however slight it is. So it rings true with the character and still allows us as an audience to connect with what's happening.
Sorry, little lady.
One of the things that Emmy Farah is really good at is she has a very critical eye. And as art director, she would step in all the time and move things around, adjust the costume. She was always really ready to see ahead of time what needed to happen for the shot to work.
She was our photographer and our logistical coordinator.
Did people have water and food? Was there a way to get in and out? When did we need to move people as far as schedules and those kinds of things? So during the week in between shoots, prep everything and have everything ready and go through the checklists and make sure it was all organized, making sure we could actually go out and film each time. Two of the kids were in costume at all times. One was having to tend to me all the time so that I didn't overheat. Someone had to always have an umbrella on me, bringing me drinks.
In that full prosthetic makeup, he couldn't eat all day.
You would think I was just the most diva director. No, I must have an umbrella and a drink. That meant that Laura, as our DP, had to do everything. She had to set up the camera, move the camera, figure out the locations, because she had done the prosthetics and she had designed the costumes. So some of the costume resetting only she could do. Some of the things like with taking the eyes in and out only she could do. And so she was constantly running back and forth with the VTR screen, running back and forth with the costume and the makeup, going back to the camera on the tripod, switching out lenses and equipment, carrying all that around, and she had to do everything herself. She was wearing these galoshes every day because a lot of times these shots, the only way to get the shot we needed was from out in the river. And so she would just wade out into the river with the equipment and get the shots. Everyone would at some point get to rest during the day, except Laura. While everyone else would stop to just collapse and eat and breathe for a little bit, she was still working, and she did this day after day. She was a one-man show on this film.
My original plan was to go rent a studio here in town. I don't know, I just felt like, no, I should just do it right here. So being the creative, artsy type that I am, I moved all the furniture out of our living room and built a spaceship.
Just like George Lucas did on the original New Hope, where they just made a bunch of false walls that they could move around, we made wall panels out of foam board and we put them up in our living room.
They had to be distressed, and they also had to be able to take light properly and not be too reflective. In the design process, how do we have interesting shapes? Because our walls are foam, and we also have kind of backdrops behind the walls as well. How do you, across the board, make it look consistent? And that really has a lot to do with choosing what light goes on it and what colors are your undercolors that matched our backdrops that I actually designed in Photoshop and had them printed off in Austin and brought them in. You can't have your light super close. We're in this small, tight space. I bounce light off the ceiling, I bounce it off of mirrors to expand the space so that the light could be both sharp and diffused in the places that it needed to be.
So the only way to get the camera far enough away to get the shots we needed was for it to practically be inside the fireplace. That meant that anytime the angle changes, we didn't actually change the angle. Anytime the angle needs to change, we moved the whole room. So we would have to figure out ahead of time what's every shot that we need from this angle and film them all out of sequence that way. My son's computer desk is in the corner and there was no place to move it out of the room. So we left it, and then we would just stick pipes and things in the foreground so that you didn't see that there was a desk there in the middle of the spaceship. We threw down a little floor that we rolled out that we had painted, and that became our spaceship. You'd never know that we were in a 10-foot by 10-foot space to film our spaceship in. It felt much bigger than what we actually had.
So our characters have to walk outside out of a spaceship. Well, that means a green screen, but they're walking. How do you have that much space in a living room for them to walk? We had just the right amount of steps available to make this work. It's kind of like Jaws. One frame more and you would know.
On post-production, there was a lot of effects to do on this. Laura and Keith both gave me some invaluable help on some rotoscoping, some of the more tedious elements. But it was hundreds of effect shots to put into this. Lots of laser blasts and other things we didn't expect though. Things like, because Cad Bane's fingers were always ripping, so I was having to go back and remove the rips and the seams. It was fun to put Toto 360 into our film. It was a fun challenge because I'm not a 3D modeler, and that's not something that I would normally do. I wouldn't be able to build this 3D model. And so instead, I got creative. I went into After Effects, used the Element 3D plugin, and I just kit bashed a bunch of primitives, a bunch of engine parts, a bunch of pistons and tubes, a bunch of these kind of pre-made things, and made the most terribly optimized model in existence. But I stuck all these parts together until it finally looked like Toto. And just like with the design of Cad Bane, I was relentless in making sure it had a silhouette that felt like Toto. If you were to look at it on a technical level, it actually looks very different from Toto. But it feels like Toto. All the shapes are right, the things are in the right places, they have the right proportions. And this plugin that I was using, Element 3D, is not designed for animating characters in any way. So I kind of had to break it to make it do this. But in the end, I was able to have this moving robot. I would take the shots and turn those into environment maps. So he would always have the realistic environments reflected on him as he's moving through the canyon, as he's moving through the spaceship. And the spaceship was built in the same way, the Justifier. When I wrote the script, I didn't want to have Cad Bane in the Xanadu blood. It was a much smaller starfighter. I wanted him to have a big ship. I'm thinking, okay, this is a bounty hunter. He's gonna be capturing people. He needs to be able to haul people and things. He needs a much larger ship. And so I wrote the script with a larger ship in mind and storyboarded it with this big hangar. Then, right before we're gonna start shooting, Bad Batch comes out and Cad Bane has this amazing new ship, the Justifier. I'd started down the road of a different ship that we were going to use. But at this point, pulled all the images of the Justifier online and used all that to recreate the Justifier in the same way that I did Toto. It's a bunch of kit bashed parts, a bunch of engines and pistons and primitives that I squashed and stretched, you know, squares and triangles and that sort of thing. And then just mapped the reflections onto it from our shots and created this ship. And it could move, the tail moves and all that. It was pretty satisfying to be able to create that because I'm not a 3D modeler. And so it was very much fly by the seat of your pants to make our droid and to make our ship.
I wanted the item that Bane and Qualtech were after to be something interesting and uniquely Star Wars, and a lightsaber was exciting and the audience could understand quickly how significant this was. Mace Windu has had the only purple lightsaber on film, and so that choice was to help audience members who were not well versed in Star Wars lore to still feel like they understood what was going on. They could recognize it and say, hey, I think I know whose that is. Mace Windu is just such an amazing character that it implies all of this backstory and history. We were going to get a very nice Mace Windu lightsaber, and then because of availability, we couldn't get what we needed in time. So we purchased a $20 kids lightsaber, went into the shop and extended it out so that it was longer, and then distressed it until it was almost unrecognizable so that you couldn't tell that it was a toy instead of a high-end prop. Keith went and rotoscoped this lightsaber onto the Jawa for the entire minute-and-a-half shot. There's a lot of work.
So Jawas in A New Hope, they had voices that were mixed in with pieces of the Zulu language. I took this heavily butchered version of Zulu where we would just pull out words in Zulu and kind of stick them together. Originally, my daughter Alexandria was recording voice acting, but when we took that voice and sped it up like a Jawa voice, it sounded so high-pitched that it sounded like Qualtech was a child, and that was not the intention.
Hi, I'm the voice of Qualtech, and I did not volunteer. I'm pretty relaxed. Qualtech is not what I'm like on a regular basis.
I really pushed her to go crazy with it. I really wanted the Jawa to be over the top.
I really, really enjoyed it. I think I liked this too much. As a filmmaker, you have to love the people that you're with. You have to be into their success as well as your success. Beautiful projects come from when you work well with others, when you pull out from them what their greatness is. If you look at our production, this is our family. There were things that our kids were able to do I had no idea that they could even do. You gotta look into others and say, what do you bring? And everyone brings something.
Say something.
Something. This was such a fun project. We learned so much. We hope that you learned something too, and that you feel inspired to go make something of your own.